You know, a man's workshop is supposed to be the one place on earth where the rest of the world stops making noise, where the only sounds allowed are the hum of a bandsaw, the crackle of a welding torch, and maybe a little classic rock on a dusty radio. It's not just a room, it's a sanctuary, a place where I go to forget that people can be petty and loud and obsessed with things that don't matter. For 20 years, my detached garage was exactly that, my church of grease and sawdust, until Brenda decided that the bylaws of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association superseded the laws of common sense and basic human decency. Now, Brenda wasn't just a neighbor, she was a force of nature, a woman who didn't walk down the sidewalk so much as she patrolled it, armed with a clipboard that she wielded like a medieval shield and a measuring tape that she used to check the length of people's grass down to the 16th of an inch. She had this way of smiling that didn't reach her eyes, a tight, polite grimace that said, "I'm doing this for your own good," while she handed you a $50 fine for leaving your garden hose uncoiled for 15 minutes. We all knew to avoid her. If you saw her coming down the street in her pristine beige sedan, you went inside, you closed the blinds, and you prayed she didn't stop at your mailbox. But I never thought she'd have the audacity to invade my actual sanctuary until the Tuesday afternoon that changed everything. I had just come home from a double shift at the fabrication plant, my boots were heavy, my back was screaming, and all I wanted was to pull my truck into the shop, crack open a cold beer, and maybe tinker with the carburetor on my old Mustang for an hour before dinner. Simple, quiet, mine. I hit the remote for the heavy industrial bay door, watching it roll up with that satisfying metallic rattle, but instead of seeing the empty concrete slab where my truck belongs, I saw beige, lots of beige. Brenda's sedan was parked dead center in my workshop, not just nudging the entrance, but fully committed, pulled in deep enough that her bumper was almost touching my tool chest, and the engine was still running, purring softly in the echo of the room. For a solid 10 seconds, my brain just refused to process the visual information. It was like looking at a boat parked in a living room, it just didn't compute, so I parked my truck in the driveway, walked up the concrete ramp, and that's when I saw her. Brenda was reclined in the driver's seat, head tipped back against the headrest, mouth slightly open, fast asleep with the AC blasting. She had essentially turned my private workshop into her personal climate-controlled nap pod. The sheer entitlement of it was breathtaking, like she had decided that since she ran the neighborhood, every square inch of it was technically hers to requisition whenever she felt a little drowsy on her patrol route. My first instinct was to yell, to bang on the window and scare the living daylights out of her, maybe call the tow truck and watch them drag her precious sedan out by the axle, but then I looked at her sleeping face, so peaceful, so blissfully unaware of the boundaries she was crushing, and a different kind of feeling washed over me. It wasn't anger, it was a cold, calm clarity, the kind of feeling you get when you realize the time for talking is over and the time for a lesson has begun. I realized that waking her up would just lead to an argument. She'd spout some nonsense about inspecting for code violations, or feeling faint, and turn herself into the victim, and I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. So, I didn't knock, I didn't shout, I just stepped back out of the garage, hit the button on the wall to lower the heavy bay door, and watched as the daylight was slowly choked out, sealing Brenda and her car inside my dim, concrete box. Click, clack, thud. And then I walked over to the side service door, the one that leads into the house, and I turned the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying heavy click. Now, she was locked in, but she wasn't alone, because this is the part where the story gets good. I share my home with two rescues, Buster and Tank, and they aren't your average lap dogs. They're cane corsos, 130 pounds of muscle and drool each, dogs that look like gargoyles but have the hearts of marshmallows, unless, of course, they sense that daddy is upset or there's a stranger in their territory. I went into the kitchen where the boys were snoozing on their oversized beds, tails thumping lazily when they saw me, and I whispered, "Boys, we got a visitor," and immediately, the energy shifted. Buster stood up, his massive black head tilting, and Tank let out this low rumble of a woof, shaking his jowls. I opened the door connecting the house to the workshop, and the smell of exhaust and cheap perfume drifted in, causing the dogs to bristle, their instincts kicking in, not aggressive, just intensely curious and very, very protective. I gave them the hand signal to go look, and they trotted into the semi-darkness of the garage, their nails clicking on the concrete like the ticking of a clock counting down to Brenda's wake-up call. I stayed in the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion car crash. The boys approached the beige sedan silently, sniffing the tires, sniffing the exhaust pipe, and finally, Buster, the bigger of the two, placed his massive paws up on the driver's side door and pressed his giant, wet nose against the glass, staring directly at Brenda's sleeping face. It must have been the shadow blocking the light or maybe a subconscious sense of being watched, but Brenda stirred, her eyelids fluttering, her head rolling to the side, and then she opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw, inches from her face, was the gaping maw of a beast that looked like it had walked straight out of mythology. The scream she let out was muffled by the glass, but I felt it in my teeth. It was a high-pitched, primal shriek of pure terror, and she scrambled backward so hard she slammed her head against the passenger window, flailing her arms like she was trying to swim through the air. Tank, startled by the noise, let out a booming bark that echoed off the metal walls of the shop, sounding like a cannon shot, and that sent Brenda into a full-blown panic spiral. She clawed at the door handle, realized it was locked, then hit the unlock button and tried to push the door open, but Buster was leaning his full weight against it, just staring at her with this confused, dopey expression that said, "Why are you yelling, lady? Get them away." "Oh my God, get them away," she screamed, her voice cracking, and that's when I decided to make my presence known. I flipped on the overhead fluorescent lights, which flickered to life with a harsh buzz, illuminating the absurdity of the situation. The pristine HOA president huddled in her car, trapped by two dogs who just wanted to sniff her. I walked over slowly, casual as can be, and tapped on the glass with my knuckle. She jumped again, her eyes wide and wet with tears, her makeup smudged, looking less like a tyrant and more like a trapped animal. I signaled the dogs down, and they sat instantly, tongues lolling out, looking from me to her like they were waiting for a treat, and I motioned for her to roll down the window. She hesitated, her hand shaking so bad she could barely find the button, but she cracked it an inch, just enough for the sound of her hyperventilating to escape. "Jack! Jack, call them off. They're going to kill me," she shrieked, pressing herself against the center console. "They aren't gonna kill you, Brenda," I said, my voice flat and calm. "They're just wondering why there's a strange car parked in their bedroom, and frankly, so am I." I was just. She stammered, looking for a lie and coming up empty. I felt dizzy. I needed to pull over. This was an emergency. An emergency, I repeated, looking at the half-reclined seat. "So you pulled into a private garage, shut the door behind you, and took a nap. That's a hell of a medical protocol, Brenda." Before she could answer, she started wheezing, a sharp, whistling sound from her chest, and her eyes, which were already red from crying, started to swell up, and then she sneezed, a violent, full-body sneeze that sprayed the dashboard. "I'm, achoo. Allergic," she wailed, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "You have, achoo. Dogs. I can't breathe." Now, I'm not a monster. If she was actually dying, I would have called 911, but I knew Brenda, and I knew she played the victim card like a pro, plus she was screaming loud enough to shatter glass, so her lungs were working fine. She was just miserable, and honestly, seeing the woman who threatened to foreclose on the Smiths because their mailbox was the wrong shade of white now reduced to a sneezing, terrified mess in my gar. Age felt like cosmic justice. "Well, that's unfortunate," I said, leaning in closer. "Sounds like you should probably get out of here then, but see, the thing is, you're trespassing, and in this state, trespassing is a serious offense, kinda like leaving your trash cans out past 6 p.m., right?" And the words hung in the air, heavy and strange, because Brenda never apologized. She corrected, she informed, she disciplined, but she never apologized. "Just let me out, Jack, please. I'll leave, I won't come back, I swear." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, the mask slipped, the imperious community director was gone, and under it was just a scared, lonely middle-aged woman who had bitten off way more than she could chew. I nodded, just once, and whistled for the boys to back up. They retreated to the doorway, disappointed that the show was over, and I hit the button to raise the garage door. The sunlight flooded back in, blindingly bright, and Brenda didn't waste a second. She threw that sedan into reverse, tires screeching on the smooth concrete, and backed out so fast she almost took out my mailbox, speeding down the street without looking back, leaving a trail of exhaust and bad decisions in her wake. I thought that was it. I thought I'd won the war and I could go back to my quiet life, maybe get a nasty letter in the mail a week later, but I was wrong, dead wrong, because what I didn't know then was that Brenda wasn't just patrolling my garage because she was a busybody, she was stressed, she was paranoid, and she was being watched. 2 days later, the dynamic shifted entirely when I found her standing at the edge of my driveway, not with a clipboard, but with a trembling hand and a look of genuine fear in her eyes. She wasn't looking at my grass, she was looking over her shoulder at a black SUV parked down the block with tinted windows. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind, can I come inside? Not the garage, I mean, can we talk? I think I'm in trouble, real trouble, and I don't know who else to trust because everyone else hates me." I stared at her, the dogs flanking me, and I saw the bruises under her eyes from lack of sleep, the way her hands kept wringing together, and my gut told me this wasn't an HOA game anymore, this was something darker. "Come on in," I said, stepping aside, "but if you sneeze on my furniture, you're paying for the cleaning." She sat at my kitchen table, clutching a mug of coffee like it was a lifeline, and she spilled everything. It turned out that the inspections she had been doing, the aggressive fines, the constant pressure to maintain property values, none of it was her idea. She showed me emails, dozens of them, from a development firm called Apex Horizons, anonymous threats disguised as legal notices, pressuring her to enforce stricter and stricter rules to force liens on certain properties, specifically the older homes with the big lots, like mine, and like Old Man Miller's place down the road. They were using her as a pawn to drive people out so they could buy the land cheap for a commercial strip mall project they were trying to rezone. I didn't want to do it, she sobbed, and this time the tears were real. They told me if I didn't clean up the neighborhood, the property values would crash and we'd all be underwater, but then they started sending guys. I've seen them at night, Jack, walking around the wetlands behind your property, putting up markers where they shouldn't be. I felt a cold chill run down my spine because I'd heard noises out by the swamp too, snapping twigs and heavy boots, but I'd assumed it was deer poachers or kids. If Apex Horizons was sending goons to survey land they didn't own yet, that meant they were already breaking the law, and Brenda was the loose end they were about to cut. "So why come to me?" I asked. "I'm the guy who locked you in a garage with 2 monsters. Because," she looked up, her eyes stealing a bit, "you're the only one who didn't just pay the fine, you fought back, and right now, I need a fighter, because I think they're going to try to burn me to hide what they've been doing." I looked at Buster and Tank, who were snoring by the fridge, and then back at Brenda, who looked small and defeated in my big wooden chair, and I realized the neighborhood war I thought I was winning was actually just a skirmish in a much bigger battle. "All right," I said, leaning forward. "We aren't gonna let them take the neighborhood, and we sure as hell aren't gonna let some suit in a high-rise push us around, but if we do this, Brenda, the clipboard goes in the trash, understood?" She nodded, a faint, terrified smile touching her lips. "Understood." That night, the atmosphere in the cul-de-sac changed. It wasn't quiet anymore, it felt heavy, charged with static, like the air before a tornado touches down. I called up Old Man Miller, who used to be a union rep back in the day and knows more about dirt than a gravedigger, and he came over with a shotgun in his trunk and a grim look on his face. He'd suspected something was up for months. We sat in the dark living room, watching the street through the blinds, and sure enough, around midnight, the black SUV rolled by again, slowing down in front of Brenda's house, then mine. "They're scouting," Miller grumbled, racking a shell into the chamber just for the sound of it. "They know she talked." "Let 'em come," I said, petting Tank's massive head. "They think they're dealing with a lonely old lady and a mechanic, they don't know they're walking into a buzzsaw." The climax didn't happen in a courtroom or a town hall meeting, it happened 3 nights later, right at the edge of the wetlands where my property backs up against the reserve. It was pouring rain, a miserable, cold downpour that turned the ground to mud. I'd let the dogs out for their last run when I heard it, a shout, then a muffled scream, coming from the old utility shed near the property line. I grabbed my flashlight and my baseball bat. I didn't want to shoot anyone if I didn't have to, and I sprinted into the dark, the dogs already ahead of me, disappearing into the mist like ghosts. I found Brenda there, cornered against the rusted siding of the shed by two men in dark rain gear, holding flashlights that blinded her. They were shouting, aggressive, trying to grab a folder of documents she was clutching to her chest. "Give it up, lady. It's over," one of them yelled, reaching for her. "Hey!" I roared, stepping into the clearing, the beam of my heavy mag light cutting through the rain. "You boys are trespassing on private property, and I don't recall inviting any trash to the party." They spun around, blinding me with their lights, reaching into their jackets for God knows what, maybe a weapon, maybe just intimidation, but they never got the chance to find out. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the air, sounding like the earth itself was splitting open, and then Buster stepped into the light, teeth bared, hackles raised, looking like a demon from the pit. Tank flanked him on the left, silent and deadly, his eyes locked on the closest guy's throat. The men froze, their toughness evaporating instantly in the face of 260 pounds of angry canine muscle. They backed up, hands in the air, slipping in the mud. "Call them off," one guy shouted, his voice cracking just like Brenda's had in the garage. "We're just contractors. Contractors don't corner women in the dark." I yelled back, stepping closer, swinging the bat loosely in my hand. "Now get out of here before I let them turn you into chew toys." They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled back toward the road, falling over themselves, splashing through puddles, fleeing into the night as the black SUV peeled away, leaving them behind to run. Brenda slid down the wall of the shed, shivering, clutching those papers, the evidence of the bribery, the illegal zoning maps, everything we needed to bury Apex Horizons, and for the first time, she didn't look at me like a subordinate, she looked at me like a brother. The aftermath was messy, legal battles always are, Brenda testified. Miller rallied the neighbors, and Apex Horizons pulled out faster than a greased pig to avoid the scandal, but the neighborhood survived. Brenda stepped down as community director, and while she still twitches a little when she sees a trash can left out too long, she doesn't write fines anymore, she brings over cookies. We have a truce, me and her. She doesn't park in my garage, and I don't let the dogs lick her face, mostly because of the allergies, but partly out of respect. It makes you think though, about who the real enemy is. Sometimes the person annoying you the most is just the symptom of a bigger disease, and sometimes, it takes a couple of terrifying dogs and a locked garage to break down the walls between us. It's funny how a little bit of fear can clarify things, how it strips away the titles and the rules and just leaves people standing in the rain, deciding whether to fight each other or fight for each other. So, what do you think? Was I right to lock her in that garage, or did I go too far? And would you have stood up for the Karen of your neighborhood if you found out she was being played? Let me know in the comments. I read them all. Stay safe out there, and keep your garage doors closed. Scaring off two hired goons in raincoats fixes a corrupt system that's rotting from the inside out, then you haven't been paying attention to how these things work, because what I didn't tell you, what I couldn't tell you until the dust really settled, was that the night at the shed was just the opening shot, and the real war. The real war hadn't even started yet. See, we had this nice little week of peace where Brenda was bringing over snickerdoodles, which, for the record, were store-bought, but I gave her points for effort, and the neighborhood felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the air pressure drops right before a hurricane rips your roof off. I was in the shop sanding down a fender. Buster and Tank were chewing on a heavy-duty truck tire. I tossed them, when I got an email, not on my work account, but on a personal encrypted server I use for billing, from a guy named Douglas. Now, Douglas was the HOA president 5 years ago, a decent guy, a retired structural engineer who suddenly resigned and moved 3 towns over without saying goodbye to a soul, citing health reasons, which in HOA politics usually means, I know where the bodies are buried and I don't want to be one of them. The subject line just said, they aren't done, and inside was a single PDF attachment showing a wire transfer, a massive one, going into a shell account that I traced back to a name I saw every single day walking his golden retriever, Brandon, the vice president of the board. Brandon, the guy with the perfect hair, the guy who always jogged at 6 a.m. with a smile plastered on his face, the guy who had been supporting Brenda the whole time while she took all the heat for the fines. He wasn't just ambitious, he was the mole, the inside man for Apex Horizons. It hit me like a socket wrench to the forehead. Brenda was the lightning rod, the useful idiot they wound up and pointed at the neighbors to distract us, while Brandon was quietly signing off on the rezoning permits in the background, selling us out lot by lot. I called Brenda immediately, told her to get her butt over to my garage and to use the back alley so nobody saw her, and when she arrived, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Douglas contacted you?" she whispered, staring at the screen. "He told me if I ever spoke to him again, he'd sue me for harassment." "That's because he was trying to protect you, Brenda," I said, pouring us both a stiff drink because we were going to need it. "He knew Brandon was the one pulling the strings, and he knew if you started asking questions back then, you'd get crushed, but now we have leverage. We hatched a plan that was so reckless, so stupid, and so absolutely perfect that it could only have been cooked up by a mechanic and a disgraced HOA president fueled by adrenaline and caffeine. We knew the monthly board meeting was happening in 2 days at the community center, and we knew Brandon was planning to push through a emergency infrastructure vote, which was just legal jargon for, let's sell the wetlands to the developers. We needed to catch him in the act, but we couldn't just walk in with a printout of an email. We needed a confession, or at least, we needed him to panic enough to show his hand. So, the night of the meeting, I didn't go in the front door. I parked my truck 3 blocks away and snuck around back with the boys, Buster and Tank, wearing their tactical harnesses, looking like a K-9 SWAT team on a budget. Brenda went in the front, head held high, looking every bit the Iron Lady she used to be, and took her seat in the back row, dead silent. The meeting started, and Brandon was up there at the podium, flashing that $1,000,000 smile, talking about modernizing our community and unlocking value, and I was listening through a baby monitor we'd taped under the table. Yeah, high tech, I know. He was smooth, I'll give him that, slicker than oil on polished concrete, until Brenda stood up. She didn't shout, she didn't scream, she just asked one simple question: "Brandon, does the modernization plan include the kickback you got from Apex Horizons last Tuesday, or is that a separate bonus?" The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the carpet, and Brandon's smile twitched, just a fraction of an inch. I think you're confused, Brenda," he stammered, gripping the podium. "You've been under a lot of stress lately, maybe you should sit down." "I'm not confused," she said, walking down the aisle, "and neither is Douglas." At the mention of that name, Brandon's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray, and that was my cue. I kicked open the double doors at the back of the hall, BAM, and walked in with Buster and Tank flanking me on short leashes, their nails clicking ominously on the linoleum floor. The entire room turned, gasping. Half the board members looked like they were about to dive under the table, but I just kept walking until I stood right next to Brenda. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice booming in the acoustics of the hall, "sorry to crash the party, but my dogs smelled a rat, and they're usually pretty good at finding them." Brandon tried to rally, tried to call for order, shouting that I was trespassing, that I was dangerous, but he was sweating now, visible beads of panic rolling down his forehead. "You have no proof," he yelled, his voice cracking. "This is slander. I'll have you both arrested." "We don't need to arrest you, Brandon," I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my jacket pocket. It was just a car repair invoice, totally meaningless, but he didn't know that. "I have the logs, I have the emails, and I have the wire transfer numbers, so you can either resign right now and move to a different state, or we can wait for the cops who are about 5 minutes out." It was a bluff, mostly, but Brandon didn't know that, and more importantly, he looked at Buster, who was staring at him with unblinking intensity, letting out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the guy's bones. The silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife, until Brandon slammed his clipboard down, shouted, "Fine. You want this garbage dump? Take it," and stormed out the side exit, practically running to his car. The room erupted, neighbors were shouting, asking what was going on, and Brenda, for the first time in her life, didn't try to control them. she just looked at me, looked at the dogs, and let out a laugh, a real, genuine laugh that sounded like relief. In the weeks that followed, the house of cards came down, Douglas came back to testify, the remaining board members resigned in shame, and the deal with Apex Horizons fell apart once the bribery hit the local news. We didn't just save the wetlands, we took back the neighborhood from the suits and the sellouts. Now, things are different here. I'm actually on the board now, can you believe that? Me, the guy who just wanted to be left alone in his garage, now I'm the vice president in charge of common sense enforcement. We rewrote the bylaws, no more measuring grass with rulers, no more fines for sidewalk chalk, and if you want to park in your own driveway, that's your God-given right. Brenda still lives next door, and yeah, she's still a little high-strung, she organizes the block parties with military precision, but she knows that if she ever crosses the line, Buster and Tank are watching. It's funny, looking back on it, it started with a woman parking in my garage and ended with us taking down a corporate conspiracy. It taught me that you can't just hide in your sanctuary forever, sometimes, you have to open the garage door, let the dogs out, and fight for the peace you claim to want. You have to be willing to be the crazy neighbor to stop the real crazies from taking over. So, that's the story, the full, unvarnished truth of how I went from a recluse mechanic to the neighborhood watchdog. And let me tell you, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, more satisfying than sitting in my lawn chair on a Sunday afternoon, watching the sun go down, petting my dogs, and knowing that the only thing ruling this street is common courtesy, and maybe a little bit of fear of the two giants sleeping at my feet. But I want to hear from you guys, seriously. Was I too harsh on Brandon with the public shaming, or did he get off easy? And have you ever discovered that the petty drama in your life was actually covering up something much bigger? Drop a comment below, share your story, and hit that subscribe button if you want to see what happens the next time someone tries to mess with my shop. Until then, keep your tools sharp, your dogs fed, and your eyes open. Catch you on the next one.